I was standing in my bedroom, changing after a long day at the office, where I do accounting for a local furniture company. My shirt was unbuttoned halfway, and I was looking in the mirror, thinking about how fed up I was with the sameness of it all. My life over the past few years had turned into a non-stop cycle: work, home, sleep, and back again. My name is Nathan. In this story I'm going to tell you about something that flipped my life upside down. Get cozy, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and follow me to the end. It's going to be heated, I promise. And all this happened less than a month ago, in mid-March, in my house in Omaha, Nebraska. I never thought I'd find myself in a spot like this, but looking back now, I see it was unavoidable. It all kicked off on one of those quiet evenings when loneliness weighs on you heavy, and you notice how empty everything feels. I was standing in my bedroom, changing after a long day at the office, where I do accounting for a local furniture company. My shirt was unbuttoned halfway, and I was looking in the mirror, thinking about how fed up I was with the sameness of it all. My life over the past few years had turned into a non-stop cycle: work, home, sleep, and back again. My boyfriend, Greg, who I'd been living with for almost 5 years, was pulling away, swallowed up by his job as a manager at a big supermarket downtown. He'd come home late, wiped out, and our talks were just short bits about who'd buy groceries or pay the internet bill. That evening, the house felt oddly silent, almost stifling, and I felt like an outsider in the walls that used to feel so warm. I took off my shirt, tossed it on a chair, and reached for a t-shirt lying on the bed. Right then, the door flew open out of nowhere, and Owen, Greg's younger brother, walked in. He'd moved in with us not long ago after finishing college in Denver. He was 23, lanky, with chestnut hair and a calm smile that always threw me off a little. I froze, pressing the t-shirt to my chest, my heart hammering so loud I could almost hear it. Owen stopped in the doorway, his eyes going wide with surprise, and he muttered, "Oh, sorry, I thought you were downstairs in the kitchen." His voice wavered a bit, and he stepped back, clearly flustered, but his eyes stayed on me just a touch too long. I tried to say something steady, like, "It's okay, don't worry about it," but my voice sounded forced, and I felt my cheeks burning up. "I just got back from outside," he said, dropping his gaze to the floor like there was something worth staring at down there. We stood quiet for a few seconds, and the air between us got thick, almost solid. I finally pulled on the t-shirt, trying to get a grip, and said, "No worries, you just caught me off guard." He nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, looking at me with an expression I couldn't pin down. "Do you like living here?" I asked, just to cut through the silence, even though the question felt dumb right after I said it. He smiled, his voice warming up as he said, "Yeah, I'm good here, especially with you around. The house doesn't feel so dead." Those words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt something shift inside, something I hadn't felt in ages. I laughed, trying to brush off the confusion, and said, "Then knock next time, all right?" He smirked, nodded, and stepped out, shutting the door softly behind him. I sat on the bed, still gripping the t-shirt even though I'd put it on, and tried to figure out what just went down. My thoughts were all over the place, and my heart wouldn't settle. That moment was the start of something bigger, and I had no clue how far it'd take me. After that evening in the bedroom, I couldn't get Owen out of my head, even though I tried hard to push those thoughts away. A day passed, then another, and I caught myself thinking more about how he'd looked at me in the doorway. It wasn't just awkwardness, there was something warm, almost magnetic in his gaze, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. I went through my usual life in Omaha, heading to work, crunching numbers for the furniture company, but inside, everything was churning, like someone flipped a switch in a dark room. Greg, as usual, was stuck at the supermarket, and I was used to spending evenings alone, but now loneliness felt different. 3 days after that moment, I decided to cook dinner to keep my hands and mind busy with something useful. I was standing at the stove, stirring sauce for pasta, when I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting to see Greg. But it was Owen, in jeans and a gray hoodie, with that easy smile that made my heart pound again. "Smells amazing," he said, stepping closer to the kitchen table, and his voice sounded so casual that I almost believed I could keep everything under control. I replied, "Thanks, I hope you like it, I made extra," and turned back to the stove to hide how my hands were shaking. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat at the table, watching me while I chopped herbs for a salad. We started chatting about random stuff, his plans to find a job in Omaha, friends he'd caught up with from Denver. "Do you always cook this good?" he asked, and I noticed he wasn't looking at the food but at me, with an attention that almost made me nick my finger. I laughed and said, "Not always, but I try when I'm in the mood." The talk flowed easy, but underneath it, there was something else, a tension I couldn't shake off. When dinner was ready, we sat down, and I put a plate of pasta in front of him, trying not to lock eyes with him too long. He dug in with enthusiasm, while I picked at my portion, thinking about how weird it felt having him so close. "Greg's lucky to have you around," he said out of nowhere, and his words hung there while I scrambled for something to say back. I shrugged and mumbled, "He doesn't notice much these days." Owen looked at me closely and said, "Well, I notice and I like it." I felt heat creeping up my neck and got up fast to take my empty plate to the sink. He stood too, grabbed his plate, and came over to set it next to mine. We stood at the sink, shoulders almost touching, and I could hear him breathing while we washed dishes in silence. "You okay?" he asked softly, and I nodded even though I knew I was lying to myself. I turned to him to say something neutral, but he was so close I forgot what I'd planned to say. Our eyes met, and for a second I thought he might lean in, but he just smiled and said, "Thanks for dinner, it was great." Then he walked off to the living room, leaving me alone at the sink with wet hands and thoughts I couldn't stop. I dried my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, trying to figure out why his words and look hit me so hard. Almost a week had passed since that dinner, and I still couldn't find peace in my thoughts about Owen. Every time I saw him around the house, my heart gave an extra beat, and I hated myself for it more than I could put into words. I'd been living with Greg for 5 years, and even though our connection had lost its warmth long ago, he was still part of my life. Omaha started feeling too small to hold secrets like this, and I worried someone might notice I was losing my grip. Work at the furniture company became my escape, where I could hide in numbers and forget what was happening at home. One evening, I decided to take a shower after a long day, hoping to wash away the tiredness and tension building up inside me. Greg had left for a night shift at the supermarket, and the house was quiet again, with only the sound of water breaking the stillness. I stood under the hot shower, eyes closed, trying not to think about Owen, but his face kept popping up in my mind anyway. I turned off the water, wrapped a towel around myself, and stepped into the bedroom, feeling a bit lighter but still restless. When I opened the door, I froze right there because Owen was standing in front of me. He looked flustered, holding a book in his hands, and said, "Sorry, I wanted to ask if you'd seen this book before." His voice was low, and he clearly hadn't expected to catch me like this, with wet hair and just a towel around my hips. I felt blood rush to my face and mumbled, "No, haven't seen it, it's probably yours." He nodded but didn't leave, and his eyes slid over me before he looked away to the side. The silence between us got almost unbearable, and I gripped the towel tighter, trying to keep myself steady. "Do you always move so quietly?" I asked, hoping to lighten the moment, though my voice shook with nerves. He smiled and said, "Only when I don't want to bother you, but it looks like that's not working." His words came out soft, and I felt something warm spread inside me, despite all my efforts to fight it. I stepped toward the bed to grab a t-shirt, but then he said, "You look worn out, everything okay with you?" It caught me off guard and I stopped, looking at him, unsure what to say back. "Just a long day," I said finally, pulling on the t-shirt to cover up and feel more grounded. He nodded and stepped closer, holding the book like it was his excuse to stay. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," he said, and his voice was so genuine I almost believed him. I sat on the edge of the bed, and he stayed standing, and that strange tension came up between us again, something I couldn't figure out. "Thanks, Owen, that's nice to hear," I said, looking at him, and I saw his eyes soften when he heard his name. He suddenly sat down next to me on the bed, not too close, but near enough that I could feel the warmth from his shoulder. "You deserve someone looking out for you," he said quietly, and I froze, because those words hit a spot I hadn't even thought about. I wanted to argue, say everything was fine, but instead I just stared at him, feeling my breathing turn uneven. He set the book on the bed and turned to me, and for a second, I thought he might reach out, but he just said, "Good night, Nathan." Then he got up and left, leaving me alone with thoughts I couldn't quiet anymore. After that night when Owen sat next to me on the bed, I knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. A few more days went by, and I caught myself looking for him whenever he was around the house. Work at the furniture company in Omaha still gave me a break, but at home, I felt like I was walking on thin ice. Greg stayed as distant as ever, wrapped up in his job at the supermarket, and I started wondering if he even noticed I'd changed. Loneliness, which used to just be background noise, now felt alive, pushing me closer to the edge. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine I wasn't even reading, when Owen came down the stairs. He was in a dark t-shirt and shorts, hair a little messy, and he looked so natural that I couldn't help but smile. "Can't sleep?" I asked, setting the magazine on the table, and he nodded, sitting on the couch across from me. "Thought I'd watch something if you don't mind the company," he said, and his voice was calm, but there was something underneath it I couldn't quite place. I shrugged and said, "Pick whatever you want, I'm just sitting here anyway." He turned on the TV, choosing some old road trip movie, and we sat in silence, staring at the screen, though I knew he wasn't really following it either. After a while, he turned to me and said, "Have you ever thought about leaving Omaha, starting over somewhere new?" The question threw me off, and I looked at him, trying to figure out where he was going with it. "Sometimes I think about it, but then I realize I'm used to this place," I said, and he nodded, like he was agreeing with something in his own head. We kept talking, about places we'd want to visit, how life in Nebraska can pull you in. He told me about college in Denver, how he missed wide open spaces, and I noticed his eyes light up when he talked about things that mattered. I suddenly said, "You make me feel like I've missed out on something," and he went quiet, looking at me so closely that I wished I'd kept my mouth shut. "You haven't missed anything, maybe you just haven't found it yet," he said softly, and I felt my heart tighten from how real he sounded. The movie played on, but we both stopped paying attention, and I noticed he'd shifted closer to me on the couch. Our knees were almost touching, and I could feel the warmth of his leg through the thin fabric of his shorts. "You okay, Nathan?" he asked again, like he did in the bedroom, and I nodded, even though everything inside me said otherwise. I turned to him, and he was so close I could see every detail of his face in the soft glow from the TV. "Sometimes I don't know what's going on with me," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I meant, almost like a confession. He leaned in a little and said, "You don't have to figure it all out right now, just be you." His words were simple, but they hit me deeper than I expected, and I felt my hand move toward his shoulder on its own. I stopped halfway, but he saw it and gently took my hand, holding it in his. That moment lasted just a few seconds, but it was like a spark that lit something up inside me. I pulled my hand back, mumbling, "I need some water," and got up to head to the kitchen, though really I just needed a break. Standing at the sink, I heard him turn off the TV, and I knew that night was another step I couldn't take back. After that night in the living room, I realized fighting myself was getting harder, and Owen was on my mind almost all the time. 2 more days passed, and I felt the house in Omaha turning into a place where every room held a piece of him. Greg still left for work at the supermarket, leaving me alone, and I started noticing how much I missed the warmth we hadn't had in ages. Work at the furniture company wasn't an escape anymore, because I'd come home feeling like something was about to happen. And it did on a Saturday, when rain pounded the windows and the house was quieter than ever. I was sitting in my bedroom, watching drops slide down the glass, trying to distract myself with a book I'd pulled off the shelf. The door creaked, and I looked up to see Owen standing there, holding a mug of coffee. "Thought you might like something warm," he said, handing me the mug, and his voice was so gentle I couldn't help but smile. I took the coffee, feeling his fingers brush mine just a little, and said, "Thanks, this is exactly what I needed." He didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me with that same focus that always threw me off balance. We started talking about the weather, how rain makes Omaha feel cozier, and I noticed he was sitting closer than usual. His knee touched mine lightly, and I felt warmth through his jeans, but I didn't pull away because it felt good. "Have you ever danced in the rain?" he asked out of nowhere, and I laughed, shaking my head, and said, "No, but it sounds like something worth trying." He smiled, his eyes lighting up like he could already see it, and said, "Maybe we'll try it together someday." The conversation faded, and I set the mug on the nightstand, feeling the silence between us grow deeper, almost solid. He leaned toward me, and before I could think, his hand rested on my shoulder, soft but sure. "You make me feel alive," he said quietly, and I froze, because those were the exact words I'd wanted to say. I looked into his eyes, so close now, and felt my breathing hitch as he slowly ran his hand down my back. It wasn't just a touch, it was like a promise, and I couldn't pull away because I wanted it just as much. I leaned toward him, and our faces got so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. "Owen," I whispered, and he said, "I'm here, Nathan, I'm not going anywhere." His hand slid to my neck, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into that moment, full of tenderness and something more. We didn't say anything else, just sat there, pressed together, and I felt his fingers gently running through my hair. The rain tapped against the windows, and I realized this was one of those moments I'd never forget. He pulled back just a bit, keeping his hand there, and said, "You don't have to be alone if you don't want to." I nodded, lost for words, and he shifted closer, wrapping his arms around me like it was the most natural thing. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth wrap around me, and for the first time in forever, I didn't feel alone. After that rainy Saturday, I knew Owen had become more to me than just a fleeting spark in my life. Another day passed, and I felt like I was in a haze, trying to process what was happening between us in this house in Omaha. Greg was still off at his supermarket job somewhere, and I didn't wait for him to come home with the same eagerness I used to. My routine at the furniture company felt hollow, because all my thoughts kept circling back to Owen and how he looked at me. Sunday evening came quietly, and I decided to stay in my bedroom to sort out my head. I was lying on the bed, listening to the wind rustling outside, when the door opened, and Owen walked in with a small smile on his face. "Didn't want to bother you, just thought you'd be here," he said, closing the door behind him, and I felt my heart pick up speed. I sat up, looking at him, and said, "You're not bothering me, I'm glad you came." He walked over and sat next to me, so close I could feel the warmth of him through my clothes. We didn't talk at first, but the silence wasn't awkward, it was calm, filled with something unsaid. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper, as he looked into my eyes. I felt heat climb up my neck and said, "Me too, Owen, and it scares me more than I expected." He leaned closer, and I didn't pull away because I wanted it more than anything. His hand touched my cheek, warm and gentle, and I closed my eyes as he slowly moved toward me. Our lips met, careful at first, almost hesitant, but then he pulled me closer, and I wrapped my arms around his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hands slide down my back, pressing me nearer. It wasn't just want, it was like coming home after a long trip. I ran my fingers through his hair, and he let out a soft breath, leaning into me so I could feel every rise of his chest. We pulled back to catch our breath, and he smiled, looking at me with such tenderness I nearly melted. "You okay?" he asked, and I nodded, though words stuck in my throat from all the feelings rushing through me. I took his hand, lacing our fingers together, and said, "With you, I feel better than I ever have." He shifted closer, and we kissed again, soft but sure, full of warmth and trust. His hands rested on my waist, and I pulled him toward me, feeling him match every move I made. We lay back on the bed, and he shifted over me, but it wasn't rushed, it was slow, like we wanted to hold on to every second. I felt his breath on my neck, and my fingers traced his shoulders as he whispered my name. It was a moment where everything else, Greg, Omaha, my old life, faded away, leaving just the two of us. When we finally stopped, lying side by side and holding hands, I looked at him and knew this was more than just heat. "I don't want this to end," I said quietly, and he squeezed my hand, saying, "It won't end, Nathan, I promise." We stayed there, listening to the quiet house, and I knew that night was the start of something new, something I couldn't predict. After that Sunday night, I knew my life in Omaha would never be the same again, and Owen had become its center. A week went by, and I was living like I was split between two worlds, one with Greg, cold and familiar, and one with Owen, warm and dangerously real. Greg came back from a night shift at the supermarket on Monday, and I met him in the kitchen, trying to act normal. He asked, "You okay? You seem distracted?" And I nodded, mumbling something about being tired from work at the furniture company. But deep down, I knew he'd soon see how much I'd changed. Friday evening rolled around, and Greg left to visit a friend in Lincoln for the weekend, leaving me alone with Owen in the house. I was sitting in the living room when he came down the stairs, looking at me with that soft smile that meant everything now. "Want to talk about us?" he asked, sitting next to me, and I felt my heart tighten from how direct he was. I turned to him and said, "Yeah, I do, because I don't know how long I can keep living like this." He took my hand, squeezed it, and said, "Then let's figure out what to do together." We sat close, and I felt the warmth of his shoulder as he talked about how much he needed me. I leaned into him, and he pulled me into a hug, bringing our faces so close I could feel his breath. "I don't want to lose this," I whispered, and he nodded, kissing me slow, with a tenderness that made everything else fade away. His hands slipped under my t-shirt, and I pressed myself against him, feeling him move with me in a way that felt so right. We went up to my bedroom, and he shut the door, looking at me with a certainty I couldn't push back against. I stepped toward him, and we fell onto the bed, laughing quietly as he pulled off my t-shirt. His fingers brushed my skin, and I held him close, feeling his warmth blend with mine. We lay there, legs tangled, and I heard him whisper my name as his lips grazed my neck. It was more than just a moment. It was like a promise we'd find a way through. When we stopped, lying side by side and holding hands, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about Greg and what came next. "Do you think we should tell him?" I asked, and Owen turned to me, his eyes serious. "If you're ready, I'll be with you, no matter what happens," he said, and I nodded, feeling fear mixed with relief. We fell asleep together, and for the first time in ages, I felt like I was where I belonged. I woke up alone in the morning. Owen had gone back to his room so we wouldn't risk it if Greg came home early. I went downstairs, made coffee, and stood by the window, thinking about how I'd made a choice that would change everything. Greg got back on Sunday, and I greeted him with a smile, but inside, I knew the truth would come out soon. Now I'm leaving it to you, my friends. Do you think I should tell Greg everything right now? Or should I wait until I sort out my feelings? And do you think Owen would do the same if he were in my shoes? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear what you think.